Hello and welcome to the third plenary session of World Lumen Congress 2021. I am very happy to be your moderator for this session. My name is Alexandra Huidu, and I have the pleasure to present to you two wonderful researchers who are very well known in their fields, who actually in the international scientific community need no presentation, because when you say Barry Jackson and you say Pierre CLERO, you know exactly what you're saying, and you know that you are going to have wonderful speeches and wonderful presentations, and that you are going to leave that conference enriched with ideas, with sentiments, and of course with questions. So if there are any questions and you want to connect with the plenary speakers today, please visit the virtual desk and the virtual open space of the conference, of the Congress. You have the links in the conference program. Also, please note that this session is broadcasted live on Facebook, and also it is recorded and will be posted on the YouTube channel of Lumen Publishing House. In case you wish your personal data to be anonymized, please use the avatar mode by posting a neutral picture on your home screen and by using an avatar name. The two plenary speakers I have the great pleasure of introducing to you today are from the United States of America and from France. The first plenary speaker is Dr. Barry L. Jackson, professor PhD at Bloomsburg University of Pennsylvania, United States, which is going to talk to us about the perception of reality, subjective and objective epistemologies. The second speaker for today is Professor PhD Pierre CLERO from the University of Rouen, France, who is going to give us a speech on the manufacturing of false windows in law and ethics, symmetries and dissymmetries of values. Without further ado, I will let the speakers for today enchant you with their ideas. Hello, welcome, welcome.
Hello. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, the organizers of the conference, dear colleagues and dear friends, I would like to begin by saying how honored I feel to have been invited by the University of Iasi to give a talk at this important World Lumen Congress, celebrating 20 years of Lumen. For this celebration, I will focus, you have said, my speech on a problem of general ethics. I have chosen for that the title, The Manufacturing of False Windows in Law and Ethics. It's a beginning of an analysis of symmetries and dissymmetries of values. There exist in ethics many values that seem to enjoy full positivity, which is expressed by names, but which in reality hide either asymmetries of or false balances between the very opposed values they pretend to reconcile, while this pretense turns out fruitless. Such is a case of three sorts of values that we want to study specifically: secularity, tolerance, and dignity. In promoting secularity and tolerance, the state intends to keep in each other's presence values opposing to a point of irreducible conflict, and to unite in the same community the persons who support them. The state succeeds in doing so by pretending to adopt an intermediate philosophy that, as John Rawls said, does not imply any metaphysical position. In other words, this philosophy may be adopted by any citizen, whatever his or her values. But this neutrality is evidently a counterfeit. It does not and cannot exist. Any value affirms position of existence. If, in the name of secularity, the state imposes values, these values enter the game of powers with the others and must debate with them. We cannot say that they resolve the conflict simply because there is no such thing as philosophy that makes everyone agree, provided they be in good faith, leaving aside all the others' text in bad faith under the pretense that they would refuse such a deal. Nothing is simpler for a man that displays a certain ethical nihilism than accepting these intermediate values. Nothing is more difficult, on the contrary, than doing the same for these men or women that have strong values whose requirements are well defined. Similarly to the effect of secularity, the effect of tolerance appears to be greater for some than others. Should one accept this situation and stand by it? Or should this inequity of effort among citizens be taken into account? However, now to get that, when it seems that the systems of separation of churches and state, of beliefs from their acting out, are starting to show their limits, as it could be the case nowadays. Should it not be possible to get out the intermediate values of hypocrisy in radically changing the essence of the law and the nature of our relation to law? If secularity and tolerance generally raise similar issues, dignity poses different problems. Dignity affirms that every human being has the right to be respected. But first, under the abstract and steady label of dignity, society is satisfied with a dynamic set of compensations. Man can mistreat man and disregard their dignity without their dignity being affected if those who are mistreated react with dignity to their mistreatment. Second, a racist, sexist, unequal behavior may persist alongside an affirmation of dignity if the actor is convinced that the individuals he mistreats are inferior to the men entitled to discuss dignity. Such is the case of David Hume, who, although he is the author of a great discourse on the dignity of human nature, of which he supports the value even in its illusions, displays without any embarrassment his racism against blacks, even when the evidence is given to him that a warfare successor to Newton at Cambridge can have black skin. It is a case of Francis Williams. The problem is not that of dignity, but it is to know who may benefit from it and on what to trigger the notion. Let's not forget that it took more than 50 years after the Declaration of Human and Citizen Rights for the French Republic to abolish slavery. During all this time interval, the contradiction did not seem so exorbitant to most people who lived in the first half of the 18th century. Society can feel self-righteous by highlighting such values as dignity, and yet by putting up with what we view as amazing contradictions. These contradictions can function durably so long as none of us implementing them notices. By selecting these three values, secularity, tolerance, and dignity, we do not mean they are the only ones likely to fulfill the definition of Dissymetries and false balance, more or less hidden underneath. What is done in very different way depending on the language. The present analysis could be extended to many other values like respect or ethical behavior like consent. We only expect to show that in a very large number of cases, values which their supporters take care of to let them appear well balanced are really underpinned by imbalances, denied with such a success that even very wise philosophers get caught up in them and keep only one side of the notions they use. Dignity is relative to shame. Somebody is undignified who displays a shameful behavior without feeling the slightest touch of shame, or who knows how to prevent shame, how to curb it and circumvent the beginnings of shame. One can keep dignity, whereas one is treated shamefully. Such is a point Sartre, French philosopher, forgot. He describes shame as one of the most acute feelings, one of the most painful, as the feeling that makes us feel the best of our existence for others. But shame may be involved in situations where it never occurs as an experienced feeling. In any case, not in another form than that of a representative of shame, which is worth for it. Shame may be an affect that one of the actors of the situation is waiting from another as what should be felt and the place and the role she is or he is in. But that this other does not necessarily feel and even does not dream of feeling at all. Whomever sees him act like this, fancy that he should feel ashamed if he were in his place, but nothing can prove it. So in such circumstances, and it is not the only one, an affect, though felt by nobody, precisely because of its absence itself and being never where it is expected, an affect is able to saturate all the positions of a situation. I can say before an act that loathes me, it's a shame, or it's shameful. I do not feel the slightest attack of shame, and I do not wait for anybody to feel it. What is real in this effect is less to be felt than the necessity to be situated in relation to this effect, than the fact to treat it as a money or to make it circulate incessantly like the words of a language. Not to be in a position to have this feeling or only by delegation in place of others. Such is a rule. The shamefulness is the indication of the place where shame should be felt. The fact that it is not felt being precisely a constituent of what is shameful. If Sartre has written the phenomenology of the vivid erlebnis of shame, Aristotle analyzed the shamefulness as a chisel in a chiseled way. If shame and shameful seem the closest possible terms, the modes of being that designate are the most distant, shameful being something to have constantly a strategy towards shame, shame being the affect likely to burst beyond all strategy and reducing it to nothing. Several times we have heard the term place, to be in place, to take place, etc. The game of dignity, which is that of shame and shamefulness, is deeply that of sympathy, understood in the sense of Hume and Smith, later criticized by Bentham. Through sympathy, we believe we are in unison with each other, whatever he be in a position to abuse or to be abused, with what he experiences situated as he is, with what he should feel. In reality, this unison is never obtained, not even the slightest sketch. Only an affective images arises that we take for an affect and that we imagine being able to accommodate in the place occupied by the other. So there is a forgery of the sympathy. Hughes know it very well without denying its social usefulness. Adam Smith believes that he could go further in showing that the affect we assign to another was less a copy than some sort of resolution to the situation. If, for instance, in a given situation, somebody does not seem to feel the affect he should experience, everything happens as if I felt it in its place. And so, as if I restored a compromised balance in the relations I witness. However,
Professor CLERO, 3 minutes left. I'm sorry. You have 3 minutes
my
left.
time is
yes.
over? Oh.
Almost over. You have 3 minutes left.
Yes. So I suppose now I must answer to questions. No, perhaps not?
Please try to conclude. No. We will take questions after Dr. Barry Jackson makes his presentation also.
Perhaps I can conclude.
Yes, please. Yes.
I expected to speak about tolerance and secularity, but for my to conclude in a few words, I can say a word of which we have only presented one aspect, consists of being vigilant about Dissymetries, false symmetries, false windows that circulate underneath and through values rendered deceptively stable because they are designated by nominal entities. Let us not believe that this work merely holds theoretical reach. Its practical value is to denounce as fallacies the dissymmetries described above. However, we must pay attention to the fact that a critical or conceptual work, though it must overcome immediate appreciation, cannot be substituted to them without care. It is not impossible that if we set aside in order to fight them, the perverse game of racism, sexism, colonialism, economic inequalities, it may be necessary to grant some unconscious leeway to values in order to keep a tension between those values as they appear along with their production, which follows quite another logic. Well, thank you for your attention, and excuse me for everything.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jean-Pierre CLERO, for your wonderful speech. Now it gives me great honor to present Dr. Barry L. Jackson from Bloomsburg University. Dr. CLERO was so happy to speak to us and see us again after all these years that it's been a slight reverse of the order of the plenary speakers from this session. But now we are all ears, Dr. Barry Jackson.
Well, thank you very much, Ms. Ridu. I'm sort of embarrassed by your most gracious introduction. Hearing all those accolades about me made me wonder if you read the wrong bio. I really do feel privileged to be included in this conference with so many accomplished scholars. And today, I sort of divert from what I normally research. And I got into it quite by accident. I started writing my paper based on a perception and presentation that I made for Lumen in 2018 at Târgoviște. And there I talked about miracles and psychology. As I researched more on this topic to write this paper, I realized that what was essential was a person's worldview, how we view the world, and what we think about what we see or experience. And from there, I found a conflict between the two epistemologies of objective, empirical, science-based, and the more subjective areas of religion, magic, superstition, whatever you wish to call it. And from there, I began to look at what other people had written and said. And I came to some basic realizations about how we think about what we think we know, basically. If you're able to, at this time, do a split screen for yourselves, those listeners, and look at my PowerPoint, I'm not able to do that right now, but if you're able to, you can follow along with some of what I'm going to say. I really organized my presentation in 4 sections, and I'm going to somewhat divert from that as I present this, because I think that, well, frankly, I just do better in live audiences in front of people where I can read what they're reacting to. And as I sit here, I'm not going to read a paper because I just don't relate to that very well personally. I want to start by saying that human perception is the basis for language, and language becomes the basis for how we think, how we structure what we think. When we perceive something, we label it in some way. We try to understand it. We give it a meaning. We give it a symbol. That symbol then becomes the way we think in the future, and it becomes the way we make an utterance. So if I want to communicate to you, I have a thought, I give that thought a sound in my head, and I duplicate that sound in reality, and I present that to you. As I put more and more sounds together, I create a language. That language then becomes embedded in our experiences, which become our culture. And H.H. Stahl, Henry Stahl, wrote in 1980 that we cannot separate ourselves from our language and our culture. He's a great sociologist who had some wonderful insights, and his insight about this was simply that if you're from another culture, it is almost impossible, if not impossible, to fully understand a new culture because we do not have the cultural history and background that the native speaker has. That there are nuances of words. In a previous speech, I talked about those nuances and how I got into trouble one time by telling a young woman that she was attractive. And in English, in America, attractive simply means you look nice, you're pretty, and nothing sexual involved. But in that culture, it had a wholly different meaning. And so I found myself in an embarrassing situation of having to apologize when I meant to give a compliment. So I began to think back on some of my experiences about these kinds of things and realized that Stahl was correct. We cannot truly understand another culture unless we're raised in it. Now, some will object to that, and that's okay. We can talk about that at the end. So everything begins then with our perception and how we create our language, and from the language, we create a culture. So we create these mental images, we put them together, become our language, and they become our sounds. And the language itself then forms a way in which we think, which then again takes future observances, future perceptions, future experiences, and molds them to fit our past experience. So we have an expectation of what to experience. And everything then surrounds itself around those expectations. Alan Wallace talks about this, and so did Thibodeau, and both said that the reality of what we see is based on the experience of our culture as we understand our culture. And so a culture's language doesn't reflect reality, rather it creates the reality we understand. And so when we look at two different types of understandings of the universe, whether it be the scientific empiricism or the Enlightenment period as we tend to know it from the 1600s, or whether it be the more subjective religious magic, whatever you want to call that, we come to our experience with an expectation of how to interpret that experience. David Morgan talks about the covenant of perception, and what he says is that there are two things that are necessary for us to understand things. One is the perception itself and the anticipation of what we will perceive. Let me give an example. If I say the word house, casa, whatever word you want to use, we understand what that means. We all have some idea of what a house is. It's a dwelling, a place that we live in, perhaps. But are all houses the same? Some are made of brick, some are made of wood, some are made of stone, some are round, some are multiple stories, some are one story. They take on different meanings. But if I say house to you, you have a basic understanding what a house is, but it may be very different from what my full understanding of that word is. And so we can look at any word in any language and we find the same situation. So the covenant perception, as Morgan called it, requires the two things: the perception itself of whatever is out there, that we call reality. And reality may exist, but do we fully know it? And that really becomes the central question. Can we really know what reality is? Reality is always that objective thing out there, if there is an objective thing out there, is perceived by us and interpreted by us through our perception and expectation of what that perception represents. So there were some really interesting people I ran into, Max Planck, for instance, Albert Einstein, just to name two big names in science, who basically said, look, there may be a reality, an objective reality out there, but our ability to know that is limited by our expectations and by our understandings of what we've already perceived.
Mhm.
So in this covenant of perception, we see an object, hear a sound, however we perceive something. And we take that perception and run it through our filters of our culture. And I would maintain that this perception, in a way, becomes guesswork, because the brain itself does some things that are interesting. And this is where the psychology of it comes into effect. We all have a blind spot in each eye. It's where the retina attaches to the nerve in the, that goes back to the brain, the optic nerve. That has no receptors for light. And yet we don't perceive that. And why is that? It's not just because we have binocular vision where we can turn our heads and so on, because people with limited sight, blind in one eye, still do not see the blind spot. And why is that? It's because the brain anticipates information and fills it in. We anticipate what we're going to see. And so the brain automatically fills it in. This is a biological fact that occurs. So what we see is not necessarily what really exists. So Anil Seth says that perception is really an informed set of guesswork, that we're guessing about what the world is. And what I want to point out is that I'm going to cut over a few things because of the interruptions, but Hoffman and O'Sullivan talk about the reality and say that they're neuroscientists, by the way, and say that the senses interpret things based on what the brain reflects and not reality, not the nature of reality. So language embedded in our thought creates how we think about the next observation. Plato's allegory of the cave best illustrates this point. People are chained all their lives facing a wall. All they can see on the wall are shadows that are projected from a light behind those objects. And so for them, the shadows on the wall become reality. Einstein, in a very interesting interview, said that, in a sense, that's all scientists do. We see something and we interpret it. I'd like to read a little piece, if I can find it quickly, from Alan Wallace. And I think this sets the tone for what I want to conclude. There is only one world. The world which we call nature exhibiting patterns is discoverable by the methods of science and empirical investigation. And there is no separate realm of the supernatural, spiritual, or divine, or teleological existence. Life is no different than the particles that comprise the universe. We know nearly all the particles in the universe, and these particles do not include anything supernatural. This is the scientist's story. And this is where I got into this whole concept of the two different epistemologies. Miracles occur. There's evidence of it. There's some really good scientific evidence about prayer helping other people who don't even know they're being prayed for. But we know that magic, if you want to call it that, spiritualism, religion, says there's more than just the particles that make up the universe. The true scientist says that's all there is. As Alan Wallace says, that's all there is, just these particles, and that we are nothing but particles. And yet these particles do not explain consciousness. Max Planck said, we cannot get beyond consciousness. It's consciousness that creates reality, not the other way around. So the point I find is that science has its own methodology, and in a sense, its own culture. It creates its own language. It created a concept of atoms and subparticles and put all that together to explain their observations. But at the heart of it, they have observed something that may objectively be out there, but they have subjectively interpreted it and given it their own language and their own culture from which they cannot escape any more than Romanians can escape Romanian language or Americans can escape American English. So my conclusion is that how we see things is dependent upon how we interpret them based on the language and the culture. And so the scientist who insists that nothing exists except particles is a prisoner in a real sense of their own cultural language. And therefore they deny anything that isn't understood in a scientific manner. They deny the miracle, they deny the religious, the spiritual, the magical, because it doesn't fit their epistemology. If you go on the website and see the PowerPoint, I give you some examples and little games for you to play and see if you can solve some of those perceptions. Because I think that in looking at those, you'll get some of the sense of what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I don't know if it's okay for me as a moderator to be the first one to ask questions. Therefore, I will not be the first one to ask the first question, and I will ask the other participants if they have any questions for Dr. Jackson.
Hi, Barry.
Hey, Eric, how are you?
I'm doing well in Papua New Guinea, so
good.
You know,
good. It's been a while since
point,
we've seen each other.
Yeah, we saw each other in Dragovich Day.
Right.
Yeah, the situation, your situation, it reminds me of the cartoon where several blind people are feeling up an elephant, different parts of an elephant, and the elephant is the objective reality. But the blindfolded people, one has hold of the leg of the elephant, and he says, "I have a tree." Right. The one holds the tail of the elephant and says, "I have a brush." Someone holds the nose of the elephant and says, "I have a hose." Now, from their subjective experience, that's what they perceive. But because of their lack of what the philosophical school is called perspectivism, the idea that where you stand in relation to reality says what you will perceive that reality to be. And I always go back, I'm sure being a psychologist, you know the work of George Kelly. So a lot of what you were saying fits into what he would write about constructive alternativism. And then another book I would recommend is Wayne Booth's Critical Understanding on the Limits of Pluralism. And he talks about these very issues about the scientific knowledge and such. George Kelly had said that it would be it's wrong for the scientists to say reality is only particles. It's only the physical things I can measure. So it's the if only thinking or nothing but thinking that causes the problem that you described.
Yes, and what's interesting to me is the movement towards saying that consciousness is what is real, what creates reality. No one can explain consciousness. How do we take 3 pounds of gray matter and somehow or other that interacts and become conscious. We don't know. I find it fascinating too that particle science does not explain gravity. We found no gravity particles. So what is gravity? We know it exists. I worked with a man 35 years ago named John Havorka, Dr. John Havorka. He was a NASA scientist, and he taught physics and astrophysics where I was teaching at the time. And John had an interesting perspective. He said after all of his experiences with outer space, he just said, you know, there is nothing that I can accept that can explain all my experiences, except that there must be a higher plane of reality. There must be a mastermind who created all of this. And that's no different than saying, in the scientific method, we have all these things where we create atoms and all these substructures, and they become reality. He said to accept the fact that there is a superior being, a God that has a plan, is no less viable than accepting the assumptions of science.
Yeah, that's true. You know, there. Of course, I come from the Church of England, an Anglican background, and we never seem to have a problem with the science versus art or religion, because ironically, fundamentalist Christianity uses an empiricist type of approach without the science. And that then leads for them to try to claim the literalism of the earth in 6 days, which causes all sorts of problems. But like I say, it's quite fascinating. Well, a lot what your presentation was is a lecture I give my own students. We crossed a lot of paths there, so I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thank you. Other questions? Alexandra.
As we have all, oh my God, I have tons of questions like every time we meet, but we are running out of time, and I hope we will see each other in the open space of the conference. I think what Dr. Gilder asked and the story you told about your friend who was in outer space answered almost half of my questions about things that we cannot explain. And I was just thinking that maybe we cannot explain them yet. And maybe at one point, maybe science will reach that point. I don't know. That was my basic question.
Yes. If you go back to my speech in 2018 and the paper that came from that, one of the things that I pointed out was miracles are, at this point, things that we cannot explain yet.